I would like to tell you a few more words about the CSS grammar and show you where we most often make mistakes when creating CSS styles. I will try to explain what happens most often when your CSS styles don't work. This will make your learning and initial work easier. So let's start at the beginning. First thing, lowercase letters. Does lowercase or uppercase matter? Yes, when it comes to selectors. We use lowercase letters in CSS selectors as in HTML tags. So we should use the same letters in selectors as in HTML. If we have written a class name uppercase in HTML, we must also use uppercase in CSS selector. The size of the letters does not matter in our declarations. If you put a property name like letter spacing in capital letters, it will work anyway. Such a property will be correctly recognized by the browser. However, a good habit recommended by most of the developers is to write everything in lowercase. Unless we use a capital letter in the class name in HTML, then we have to write it in CSS as well. In this slide, you can see that the second selector was capitalized, so it won't be found, because the HTML p tag is written in lowercase. Another very common cause of the errors is the lack of the semicolon at the end of the declaration. Remember to end each declaration with a semicolon. However, the semicolon is not required at the end of the last declaration, as in the second case in this slide. But when we want to add a new declaration after some time, we may forget to add a semicolon to that declaration, which will result in an error. Therefore, it is better to get into the habit of ending each declaration with a semicolon. In this case, both rules are correct, although the second one does not end with a semicolon, but remember to add the semicolon at the end of every declaration. Another common thing that causes the errors is the lack of the colon between the property and the value. However, in this slide, I wanted to show you an error that is not related to the missing colon, but to the missing semicolon. We can see in our second rule, no semicolon at the end of the middle declaration. As a result, the browser will correctly interpret the entire middle declaration, but due to the lack of a semicolon at its end, it will treat the entire last declaration as a further part of the value of the previous declaration, but will not recognize it and will not use it. As a result, the middle and the last declaration will be not taken into account by the browser, all because there is no semicolon at the end of the middle declaration. Another thing that is good to know about are the comments. They may not be a common cause of errors, but they are part of the CSS grammar and we will use them very often. The comments in CSS, just like in HTML and JavaScript, in each code editor, are created using Ctrl and slash keys on our keyboard. In CSS, they appear as the slashes and asterisks. Everything between the slashes and asterisks is a comment and will not be interpreted by the browser. Therefore, the comments are often used to check how something works or what something looks like on our website. For example, if we want to see what the p tag looks like without the red color on our website, we don't need to delete the entire declaration. We can just comment on it. Then it will not be taken into account by the browser. And when we want to turn it back on, we just need to uncomment it. To comment or uncomment a certain line of code, just place the text cursor on that line and press Ctrl and slash on your keyboard. Another things are the names of the properties. Property names have one word, but sometimes they can have a couple words. In such cases, words are separated by a dash. Otherwise, the property name will not be recognized by the browser. Before I show you how we mostly make the errors in practice, I would like to mention a few things that are worth knowing at this moment. First, classes and identifiers. They are our choice. How we use them as the developers is entirely up to us. In your career, you will come across many different methodologies for using identifiers and classes. Choosing a way to use them is less important, but understanding and knowing how to apply them is significant. Take note of this example. Here we have a rule referring to a selector consisting of two classes. Take the art class, which is a descendant of the red class. We don't have to build the selectors based on the tags only. There are different ways to build the website structures and determine their appearance in CSS. Your experience or the software house in which you will work will define whether you will use classes or IDs more often and how you will build the selectors in CSS. You need to know now that a class attribute doesn't need to have just one class. It may have more of them. Then we don't add a new class attribute in our HTML tag. We put all classes for a certain element in one class attribute. In our case, we have one class attribute and two class names in it. In this way, we group the elements in different ways. Now all elements with the class big can have a larger font size. And all the class red elements can have a red color. Any element can easily have both of these classes, as in our case. The selector used in our example is also interesting. We read such a selector in this way. Take the P element that has a class red and a class big. Note that there are no spaces here. There is no descendant here. This is still one element. Such a selector refers to the P tag, which has both the red and the big classes, not one or the other, both at the same time. Another thing is a style reset. As we know, we have the default styles, and we usually want to reset these styles at the beginning of the project. A great example is the body margin set to 8 pixels. It is usually completely unnecessary for us. As you know, various elements like the P tag or the H1 tag have also default margins. And that would be good in itself if we weren't going to style the website ourselves. But we as the developers want to give the elements our own margins. And that is what the universal asterisk selector is for. It says take all the elements on the website, each element separately, and apply to each element the properties that are contained in the rule. In this case, it is to reset the margins and the paddings. But sometimes we don't want to assign the values to each element individually. Sometimes we want to take the advantage of inheritance. Then we can, for example, use a rule for the main HTML element. We can assign a certain font size to it, for example, and we are sure that it will be inherited by all the elements that do not have a font size set precisely. You could of course write this font size in the first row where we have an asterisk, but then you would assign this font size to each element separately. And in this case, the font size will be inherited from the HTML root element. We will learn about the difference between inheritance and precision in this course when talking more about the cascading, so don't worry about it right now. But for now, just know that the properties can be assigned precisely or can be inherited. Before we get down to the practical searching for errors, I wanted to tell you something else that we started our theory with. CSS logo and the number 3 in it. CSS version 3. What is it all about? The CSS specification is evolving all the time. Once upon a time, CSS had its official numerical versions. Each of them had official documentation. However, after the third version of the CSS specification, the language grew so much that it ceased to make sense to create a whole new document for the newer version of the entire language. Therefore, now the CSS specification is broken down into modules. A specific new module for the CSS language is created, formally introduced, and the official documentation for this module is made available. There is no need to create the whole new documentation for the newer version of the entire language. Now I would like to move on to the practical part. I want to show you how to detect certain errors, how to avoid them, and where to look for them.